Trailer music is a very important part of promoting any product, be it a film, an advert, or a YouTube presentation. And so the following chapters will be covering this topic in some detail. We will be using the template that we created in our Basics chapter right at the beginning of this tutorial. Feel free to check that chapter out again to refresh your memory as to which sample libraries or plugins we are using. We already have a finished trailer up on the screen, and this was created in approximately 2 hours. For that reason, we prepared it earlier. Whilst it might be interesting to see individual instruments being played in yet again, time is against us. But we will be going through each instrument and analysing sections. As you can see, there are many tracks in our arrangement, so playing them all in real time would have been too time-consuming. So to start with, we can listen to the first example. This is a very typical classical trailer with an epic feel to it. Perhaps not exactly what one would use for a trailer, but certainly an example of music with an epic feel. One could certainly imagine a heroic character aboard the ship as he approaches land, for example. The examples that we are showing are all relatively short, but of course they could be extended to be 3 or 4 minutes long, for example. This is simply once again because in the realms of our tutorial, it is important to see how things are created, rather than to create a finished piece. Some instruments, such as the woodwinds, come in rather quickly to show how they work, for example. To start with, we have the question, what do we start with? Do we decide on tempo, time signature, melody, chord progression, etc.? One could imagine that you need to be highly creative to start a piece of music, but this is not always the case. Of course, you need creativity, but everyone will have their own way of starting. A very typical way of starting is to choose a single sound, but a complex, possibly layered sound that suits the direction and mood you are trying to create. For example, here, as we are creating an epic trailer, I would choose a sound much like this one from the Orchestral Essentials 2 library. So by playing a few chords, you can hear that we already get a variety of ideas simply by having a sound like this. This sound is a full orchestra with choir, and a sound like this will allow you to hear your ideas with an already impressive and epic sound. A sound like this also gives you the possibility to play dynamically, so you can hear how dynamics will sound with any idea that you have. Some people might record ideas straight away whilst improvising with a sound like this. But in my experience, this can lead to a lot of questions and time-consuming options, as you may end up saying, should I keep this chord, or should I change to this chord or key, etc. It may be more practical to improvise and actually work out an idea before you record it. It may also make sense to actually write out your ideas using a pen and paper, just like we used to have to do. Once it is on paper, you can then experiment based upon your score and arrange around it. Another option is to hold a chord, which we can do using a library such as this, especially with a patch like the full orchestra and choir, and to look for melodies over the chord. This is the advantage of a virtual orchestra over simply writing at the piano, for example. Simply finding an interesting chord and holding it as long as you like, while looking for melodies, or a following chord, is sometimes a very rewarding method. And as we have seen previously, you can create interesting arrangements based on one single chord even. Of course, you have the option to record ideas into the DAW and then look at them in an editing page and even adjust specific notes until the idea works for you. So there are a multitude of different working methods when creating music. But whatever works for you is in effect right. We have created a lead sheet for our trailer. This is not a complete score, but simply has the important elements that are needed in order to perform our arrangement or trailer. If this was to be used professionally, it would almost certainly be written out by an orchestrator, especially if our ideas were to be used and performed by a real orchestra. If, on the other hand, you are simply creating music for yourself or finishing the product using your computer, it may not be necessary to have a complete score anyway. If you are working with multi-patches, such as our Albion strings or other multi-instruments, then it's a more complex matter to create a score than if you have used individual instruments for each part. If you have each instrument recorded separately, then, in effect, you have a score already. This can be very advantageous in the studio, as for example, you could hire a violinist to double your violin one instrument or replace it, or likewise have a real cellist replace the cello lines, but keeping your virtual instruments for the majority of the music. If we get back to the discussion of how to start, then often it would make sense to start with a chord progression rather than a melody as such. The reason for this is that you can create a certain mood or musical direction with chords, be it for example sad or happy. Or in this example, epic, whereas a melody by itself may not actually point in a specific direction when it comes to mood or atmosphere. If we play our example using the full orchestra and choir patch, we can use the dynamics and expression to bring in the higher voices of the choir as needed. So having used that patch to get an idea of how it will sound, I actually used the Albion 1 legato strings patch to play the chords, in order to give us a solid bass to build on. Whilst playing back, you can see that the modulation wheel has been recorded to control the dynamics. In the second half of this section, you can see how I have added notes to enhance the chord progression and to build towards the next section. The importance of this is also noticeable in the fact that we do not have the effect of repetitive chords, but the chord progression does not repeat identically. All of these details help the dynamics and movement of the music. So a certain amount of improvisation is certainly important to help the chords sound less static and repetitive. For example, here we can start the first chord, the D minor chord, with an E in it, making it a D minor 9. Also, in the lower notes, you can move from chord to chord using passing notes, rather than sticking to the root of each chord. All of these techniques can help with the richness of your arrangement. The important thing is to make your basis rich. From that point on, when you add instruments to it, the arrangement takes on an added dimension, rather than all the layers sounding somewhat static. Also, it is important to realize that even if you make slight errors in the first take, if the mood and atmosphere is right, it is much easier to edit the errors out than to start again, and perhaps not capture the feel you really want for your piece of music. Now, of course, a classically trained composer would probably not approach music in this manner. They tend to stick to the rules and follow the techniques they have learnt over the years. But this can be limiting. So feel free to approach the creation of a piece, such as our trailer here, however you feel, in order to get the best results for you. So having created the basic chord progression with the Albion legato strings, I have also layered the strings with a pad sound. This is something that is rather common these days, especially in the world of film music or trailers. Layering a synthesizer pad underneath the chords that are played by the string section simply fills out the sound stage and gives the music a fuller or fatter sound. The next instrument we played in comes from the Orchestral Essentials library and is the legato horns with trombones. Being legato means it is monophonic, but as we already know, we get the in-between portamento effect when going from one note to another. If we follow the score, we can see that the horns are playing the melody. The melody was created by simply playing over the chord progression. And of course, this can lead to a melody arriving quickly. Or you might have to put a number of hours in before you arrive at an interesting melody that suits the needs of the trailer. Then, of course, you need to be happy with your performance of the melody or parts, and this can also take time. It is possible that your first take has all the feel and dynamics you want, but it may also require a certain number of attempts before you are satisfied. One thing to note is that the melody starts before the chords do. This is important as it means we focus on the melody straight away, and especially when creating trailers, it is important to have a strong theme. By starting it before the chords, our ear is straight away led by the melody. When we get to the end of this section, we have a slight pause. This pause gives us breathing space. And as we all know, pauses or silence in music can be as important as the music itself. Then after this pause, the music comes back with a much fuller instrumentation. It is also important to notice how the bass is more static in the beginning. And as we move through the piece, it moves around more, once again giving depth and added harmony to the music. When the next section starts, we have to decide how to give the music a lift. And as mentioned, by adding instrumentation, we fill out the sound stage. If we play the next section, we can hear that the strings are also playing the melody, and they are playing it 1 octave higher than the horns. And halfway through the new section, we have a slight harmonic change, and the brass comes in. Another thing that happens is we bring some percussion elements in. For a piece of music like this, we would not necessarily bring loops in or rhythms, but using cymbals and single drum hits to enhance the accents certainly helps build the energy in the trailer. From the orchestral elements library, we have some cymbal swells. And we also use it for some rather subtle but important timpani rolls. By using the modulation wheel, we build up the dynamics of the roll over the course of a bar or so. We can see that the roll starts on bar 14, and the modulation wheel brings the dynamics up until bar 15, where we have a single timpani hit. In solo, we can hear it quite clearly. But in the arrangement, it's a subtle but important element. Of course, you could use other libraries for these type of percussion effects. Most libraries will have timpani rolls and hits. This next part is a cymbal swell. And although this could be in the cymbal folder, it is in the percussion section, because it's a multipatch which has many other percussion instruments. Also, if we look at the top, we have brought the woodwinds in. And in effect, the Albion woodwinds are doubling the Albion legato strings. The second half of the pattern also introduces the flutes, which are playing an octave higher than the other woodwinds. At the same time, we also bring in, from the Albion brass library, the trumpet. This combination gives our trailer a slightly more romantic or melancholic feel. Of course, we covered this in a previous chapter. By playing the same melody but on a variety of instruments, we can give the music a different feel or mood. To sum this example up in this context, we start with the melody in a lower register. Then the strings come in an octave higher, and then the trumpets come in, so we have the melody stacked by 3 instruments. We also do the same thing with the accompaniment. We start with the brass section in the middle, and then from bar 15 on, we add the additional brass to fill out our arrangement. The brass also starts playing somewhat more from this section on, and the reason we can do this is because the strings in the Albion 1 section are playing less at this point. So once again, I have related what I play on the brass tracks to my initial performance. So now we can listen to the strings and the brass to hear this in context. We can hear that the low end is enhanced with the brass section, and then just after that section, we drop down to a much lighter section. The strings actually stop, and we bring in some extra woodwind and a solo flute. The flute comes from the Orchestral Essentials 2 library, and is a legato flute. Once again, the legato effect of this flute makes it sound much more natural, as does the subtle vibrato. For my taste, however, the flute is a touch too loud in relation to the Albion instruments. But as this is a simple exercise, the mix has not been worked on. Because of this, we have also not enhanced the mix with additional reverbs or processes. So bear in mind that this is a rough mix, and even though that is the case, it still sounds pretty realistic. The woodwinds are playing some alternative chords at this point. If we look at them, we can see that the controller is feeding the dynamics in and out. And also, in the notes, we have a slight dissonant using the A-sharp 3 note alongside the A3 note. This is quite an unusual use of these chords, and it is quite subtle, but it certainly enhances the section. Now we can listen to it with the flute, which is performing a kind of pickup in that it plays a couple of notes before the woodwinds come in with the chords. And then, just after this small section, the strings and the brass come back in, and once again the high brass is playing the violin line, the middle brass is playing the viola line, and the low brass are playing the lower string lines. The next instrument that we add to the final section is the Albion Hybrid library. This is adding atmosphere at this point. It is very subtle and has more to do with creating the mood rather than any melodic purpose. This is exactly one of those instruments that you might consider of little use as it is so quiet. But the reality is, when you mix the piece of music and then listen back to it without an instrument like this, something will be missing. So it's not important that everything jumps out at you. What is important is that it adds atmosphere, and when you take it away, you notice something lacking. At the end, we have a crescendo section, where the timpani, hybrid instrument, and the strings create a rise in volume, dynamics, and power. If we listen without the timpani, you can definitely hear that it is lacking. However, it certainly isn't loud enough to jump out at us. This, along with the cymbal swell, certainly enhances the ending. The final thing we'll look at is the nexus pad, and we can listen to this in solo to see what it does. Obviously, this is not a very natural sounding instrument, but it works as an additional tone color, and it also pads out the overall sound. Once again, an instrument like this should be used in a subtle way. Of course, using this makes the trailer sound less orchestral, and so I would personally choose not to use it here. But it is an option and clearly adds something to the atmosphere. And this is something we'll be showing in the next chapter.